Marcus Chen had always been the type of person who noticed things others missed. As a construction worker in downtown Detroit, he spent his days building and fixing, but his evenings were often spent walking through the quieter neighborhoods, thinking about life and enjoying the peace after a long day of noise and machinery. It was on one of these walks, just as the October sun was setting behind the old brick buildings, that Marcus first heard the whimpering. The sound was faint at first, almost lost among the usual city noises of distant traffic and closing shop doors, but there was something about it that made him stop in his tracks. It wasn't the crying of a child or the mewing of a cat. This sound carried a deep sadness that seemed to pull at something inside his chest. Marcus followed the sound down a narrow alley between two abandoned storefronts. The area had seen better days, with broken windows covered by plywood and weeds growing through cracks in the concrete. As he walked deeper into the shadows, the whimpering grew louder and more desperate. His work boots crunched softly on scattered glass and fallen leaves as he searched for the source of the heartbreaking sound. Behind a large green dumpster, curled up against the cold brick wall, Marcus discovered a sight that would change his life forever. A medium-sized pit bull, brown and white with distinctive markings around his eyes, was pressed as far back into the corner as possible. The dog's ribs were clearly visible through his dull coat, and his eyes held a fear so deep that Marcus felt his own heart break just looking at him. The moment the dog saw Marcus, he tried to make himself even smaller, his body trembling with terror. There was no aggression in those dark eyes, only pure fear and exhaustion. Marcus could see that this wasn't a dog who had been loved and lost. This was a dog who had known cruelty, who had learned that humans meant pain and hunger and cold nights alone. Marcus slowly crouched down about 10 feet away from the frightened animal, making himself as small and non-threatening as possible. He had grown up with dogs and understood their language of fear and trust. This pit bull had clearly been through terrible experiences, and every instinct was telling him to run or fight, but he was too weak and scared to do either. The dog's fur was matted and dirty, and Marcus could see several old scars across his muzzle and legs that spoke of a hard life on the streets. His water bowl was nowhere to be seen, and there were no signs that anyone had been caring for him. The dog looked like he hadn't eaten in days, possibly weeks, and his eyes had that hollow look of an animal who had given up hope. As Marcus remained perfectly still, speaking in soft, gentle tones, he began to piece together what might have happened. This beautiful dog, probably not even 2 years old, had somehow ended up alone and abandoned in one of the roughest parts of the city. Whether he had escaped from somewhere terrible or been dumped here by someone who no longer wanted him, Marcus couldn't know. But what he did know was that this dog needed help, and he needed it now. The temperature was starting to drop as evening approached, and Marcus knew that another cold night on the streets might be too much for the weakened animal, but he also knew that trying to move too fast would only terrify the dog more. This would require patience, compassion, and all the gentle persistence Marcus could muster. Looking into those frightened eyes, Marcus made a silent promise. Whatever it took, however long it took, he was going to help this dog find safety, food, and maybe even learn to trust again. He had no idea that this moment would be the beginning of one of the most beautiful friendships of his life, or that this scared pit bull would soon teach him about gratitude in ways he never imagined possible. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the alley before sunrise, carrying a small bag of supplies he had gathered from his apartment. He had spent most of the night thinking about the terrified dog, unable to shake the image of those fearful eyes from his mind. In the bag were a few pieces of leftover chicken, a plastic bowl, a bottle of water, and an old towel that smelled like his laundry detergent. As he approached the spot behind the dumpster, Marcus was relieved to see the dog was still there. The pit bull was awake, watching him with the same frightened expression, but Marcus noticed something different. The dog's ears were slightly forward instead of pinned back against his head. It was a small sign, but Marcus recognized it as progress. Marcus set the bowl down about 15 feet away from the dog and slowly poured water into it. The sound of the liquid hitting the plastic made the dog's ears perk up even more. Marcus then placed small pieces of chicken near the water bowl and backed away to the entrance of the alley, where he sat down on an old crate to wait. For nearly an hour, man and dog watched each other in silence. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the alley floor. Marcus could see the dog's nose working, catching the scent of the food, but fear still held him frozen in place. Every few minutes, the dog would shift slightly as if gathering courage, but then settle back into his defensive position. Finally, thirst overcame fear. The dog crept forward on his belly, never taking his eyes off Marcus, moving inch by cautious inch toward the water bowl. When he reached it, he drank desperately, as if he hadn't had clean water in weeks. Between gulps, he would look up at Marcus, ready to bolt if the human made any sudden movements. After drinking his fill, the dog turned his attention to the chicken. He ate quickly but carefully, savoring each piece while remaining alert for any sign of danger. Marcus felt a surge of sadness watching the dog eat. It was clear this animal had learned to expect that food might be taken away at any moment. When the dog finished eating, something unexpected happened. Instead of retreating immediately to his corner, he sat near the empty bowl and looked directly at Marcus for the first time. It was only for a few seconds, but in that brief moment of eye contact, Marcus felt a connection forming. The dog's tail, which had been tucked tightly against his body, gave the smallest of wags. Marcus knew he had to be patient. Trust wasn't something that could be rushed, especially with an animal who had clearly been hurt by humans before.
He left more food and water, promised the dog he would be back, and went to work.
Throughout his entire shift, he found himself thinking about those dark eyes and planning his next move. That evening, Marcus returned with a larger supply of food and a warm blanket he had bought on his lunch break. This time, the dog was waiting near the spot where the food bowl had been that morning. He was still cautious, still ready to run, but the complete terror was beginning to fade from his expression. As the days passed, this routine continued. Every morning before work and every evening after, Marcus would visit the alley. The dog began to associate the sound of Marcus's work boots with food, safety, and kindness. Gradually, the distance between them grew smaller. The dog would finish his meals closer to where Marcus sat, sometimes even lying down while Marcus talked to him in gentle tones about his day, his work, and his plans to help. Marcus began calling the dog Buddy, though he spoke the name softly and always in the same calm tone he used for everything else. He told Buddy about his own life, his small apartment, his job building homes for other people, and how he had always wanted a dog but had never felt ready for the responsibility. After 2 weeks of daily visits, Marcus made a breakthrough. As he sat talking to Buddy after the dog had finished his evening meal, Buddy stood up and took 3 small steps toward him before lying down again. It wasn't much, but it was everything. The dog was choosing to be closer to him, making the decision that perhaps this human was different from the others he had known. Bringing Buddy home to his small one-bedroom apartment was like introducing a wild animal to civilization. Marcus had spent his lunch breaks that week buying dog supplies, a proper bed, food and water bowls, toys, a leash and collar. He had arranged everything carefully in his living room, trying to create a space that would feel safe and welcoming to a dog who had never known the comfort of a real home. When Marcus first set Buddy down inside the apartment, the dog's reaction was both heartbreaking and fascinating to watch. Buddy stood perfectly still in the center of the room, his eyes wide as he took in surroundings unlike anything he had ever experienced. The soft carpet under his paws, the warm air, the gentle lighting, the absence of street noise. Everything was foreign and overwhelming. For the first hour, Buddy wouldn't move from that single spot near the door. He trembled slightly. Not from cold or fear exactly, but from the sheer intensity of processing so many new sensations at once. Marcus sat on his couch, speaking softly and letting Buddy adjust at his own pace. Every few minutes, the dog would turn his head to look at different parts of the room. The kitchen, the hallway, the windows with their soft curtains. The first night was challenging. Buddy had never slept indoors, and every sound made him alert and anxious. The hum of the refrigerator, the settling of the building, the distant sound of neighbors walking upstairs, all of it kept him on edge. Marcus ended up sleeping on the floor next to Buddy's new bed, his presence the only thing that seemed to help the dog relax enough to rest. Over the following days, Marcus watched Buddy slowly explore his new world. The dog approached each new experience with careful curiosity. He spent a full morning studying his reflection in the sliding glass door to the balcony, tilting his head back and forth as if trying to understand what he was seeing. The first time Marcus turned on the television, Buddy barked once, then spent the next hour lying down and watching the moving images with fascination. Food was another adjustment. Buddy had been used to eating quickly and defensively, always watching for threats. Now, with regular meals served in his own bowl in a quiet kitchen, He began to eat more slowly, actually tasting his food instead of just consuming it for survival. Marcus noticed that Buddy would often look up at him during meals, as if checking that it was really okay to eat without fear. The most touching moments came when Buddy began to understand comfort. The first time he stretched out completely on his new bed instead of curling into a tight ball, Marcus felt tears in his eyes. The first time Buddy wandered over to Marcus while he was reading and simply lay down beside the couch, it felt like a miracle of trust and acceptance. Marcus established routines that helped Buddy feel secure. Morning walks around the neighborhood, breakfast at the same time each day, evening meals followed by quiet time together in the living room. Buddy thrived on this predictability, and Marcus could see the dog's confidence growing day by day. The breakthrough came 2 weeks after Buddy arrived home. Marcus was sitting on his couch after work, tired from a long day, when he felt something warm press against his leg. He looked down to see Buddy resting his head against Marcus's knee, looking up at him with completely trusting eyes. When Marcus reached down to pet him, Buddy didn't flinch or pull away. Instead, he leaned into the touch, his eyes closing with what Marcus recognized as pure contentment. That evening, for the first time, Buddy's tail began to wag with real joy instead of just cautious acknowledgement. It started slowly, then built into a full, enthusiastic wagging that seemed to involve his entire body. Marcus laughed out loud at the sight, and Buddy's tail wagged even harder in response to his happiness. From that day forward, Buddy began to show more personality. He developed preferences. He liked sleeping in the morning sunlight that came through the living room window. He enjoyed watching Marcus cook dinner from his favorite spot by the kitchen doorway. And he had a particular way of greeting Marcus when he came home from work that involved a series of small, excited jumps. But the most amazing transformation was in Buddy's eyes. The fear and hollow exhaustion that had defined his expression in the alley were completely gone. Now his eyes sparkled with intelligence, curiosity, and something that Marcus could only describe as happiness. This was a dog who was finally beginning to understand that he was safe, loved, and home. 3 weeks into their daily routine, everything changed in a single moment of crisis that would test the fragile trust they had been building. Marcus arrived at the alley that evening to find Buddy lying on his side, breathing heavily and making small sounds of pain. The dog's nose was warm and dry, and he seemed unable to lift his head when Marcus approached. Panic shot through Marcus as he knelt beside Buddy, speaking in the same gentle voice he had used every day but now filled with urgent concern. The dog's eyes were dull and unfocused, and Marcus could see that whatever was wrong was serious. This was the moment he had been preparing for without realizing it, the moment when Buddy would need him to do more than just provide food and water from a safe distance. Without hesitation, Marcus made a decision that surprised even him. He carefully slid his hands under Buddy's weak body, expecting the frightened dog to snap or struggle. Instead, Buddy seemed to understand that Marcus was trying to help. The dog remained still as Marcus lifted him, his head falling against Marcus's chest as if he finally felt safe enough to let someone else take control. Marcus carried Buddy 6 blocks to his truck, talking to him the entire way, promising that everything would be okay. The dog was heavier than he looked despite being underweight, and Marcus could feel Buddy's heart beating rapidly against his arms. Several people on the street stared at the sight of a construction worker, tenderly carrying a pit bull, but Marcus didn't care about their looks or opinions. The emergency veterinary clinic was across town, and Marcus drove carefully but quickly, one hand on the steering wheel and the other resting gently on Buddy, who lay quietly on the passenger seat. The dog's breathing had become more labored, and Marcus found himself talking constantly, as much to calm his own fears as to comfort Buddy. At the clinic, Marcus burst through the doors carrying Buddy in his arms. The veterinary staff immediately took charge, whisking Buddy away to an examination room while Marcus paced in the waiting area. For the first time since finding Buddy, Marcus realized how much this dog had come to mean to him. The thought of losing him now was unbearable. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the emergency veterinarian, emerged an hour later with news that was both troubling and hopeful. Buddy was suffering from severe malnutrition and had developed a serious respiratory infection that had gone untreated for too long. His body was fighting hard, but he was weak and would need intensive care, medications, and constant monitoring for the next few days. The cost of treatment would be significant, More than Marcus made in 2 weeks, but he didn't hesitate. He gave the clinic his credit card information and told them to do whatever Buddy needed. When Dr. Martinez asked if he was the dog's owner, Marcus paused for a moment before saying yes. In his heart, he realized that had been true for weeks now. They allowed Marcus to visit Buddy in the recovery area before leaving. The dog was connected to an IV line and oxygen, lying on a soft blanket in a warm cage. When Buddy heard Marcus's voice, his tail moved just slightly and his eyes found Marcus's face. Even in his weakened state, even surrounded by strange smells and sounds, Buddy knew his person had come to see him. Marcus spent the next 3 days visiting the clinic twice daily, before and after work. Each time, Buddy seemed a little stronger, a little more alert. The veterinary staff marveled at how calm the dog remained when Marcus was around, compared to how anxious he became when strangers approached his cage. On the 4th day, Dr. Martinez called Marcus at work with wonderful news. Buddy was well enough to go home, but he would need continued medication and careful monitoring. When she asked where Marcus would be taking him, there was another moment of realization. Marcus had been so focused on Buddy's immediate needs that he hadn't fully processed the bigger picture. He was about to become the owner of a pit bull who had never lived in a home, who was still learning to trust and who would need patience, training, and love to fully heal from his traumatic past. Marcus's small apartment would need to become Buddy's first real home, and Marcus would need to become not just a rescuer, but a true companion and teacher. That evening, as Marcus carried Buddy from the clinic to his truck, he felt the dog relax completely in his arms for the first time. Buddy's head rested against Marcus's shoulder, and his tail wagged weakly but steadily. The scared, starving dog from the alley was still there, but now Marcus could see glimpses of the loving, grateful companion Buddy was ready to become. Bringing Buddy home to his small one-bedroom apartment was like introducing a wild animal to civilization. Marcus had spent his lunch breaks that week buying dog supplies, a proper bed, food and water bowls, toys, a leash and collar. He had arranged everything carefully in his living room, trying to create a space that would feel safe and welcoming to a dog who had never known the comfort of a real home. When Marcus first set Buddy down inside the apartment, the dog's reaction was both heartbreaking and fascinating to watch. Buddy stood perfectly still in the center of the room, his eyes wide as he took in surroundings unlike anything he had ever experienced. The soft carpet under his paws, the warm air, the gentle lighting, the absence of street noise. Everything was foreign and overwhelming. For the first hour, Buddy wouldn't move from that single spot near the door. He trembled slightly, not from cold or fear exactly, but from the sheer intensity of processing so many new sensations at once. Marcus sat on his couch, speaking softly and letting Buddy adjust at his own pace. Every few minutes, the dog would turn his head to look at different parts of the room: the kitchen, the hallway, the windows with their soft curtains. The first night was challenging. Buddy had never slept indoors, and every sound made him alert and anxious. The hum of the refrigerator, the settling of the building, the distant sound of neighbors walking upstairs, all of it kept him on edge. Marcus ended up sleeping on the floor next to Buddy's new bed, his presence the only thing that seemed to help the dog relax enough to rest. Over the following days, Marcus watched Buddy slowly explore his new world. The dog approached each new experience with careful curiosity. He spent a full morning studying his reflection in the sliding glass door to the balcony, tilting his head back and forth as if trying to understand what he was seeing. The first time Marcus turned on the television, Buddy barked once, then spent the next hour lying down and watching the moving images with fascination. Food was another adjustment. Buddy had been used to eating quickly and defensively, always watching for threats. Now, with regular meals served in his own bowl in a quiet kitchen, he began to eat more slowly, actually tasting his food instead of just consuming it for survival. Marcus noticed that Buddy would often look up at him during meals, as if checking that it was really okay to eat without fear. The most touching moments came when Buddy began to understand comfort. The first time he stretched out completely on his new bed instead of curling into a tight ball, Marcus felt tears in his eyes. The first time Buddy wandered over to Marcus while he was reading and simply lay down beside the couch, it felt like a miracle of trust and acceptance. Marcus established routines that helped Buddy feel secure. Morning walks around the neighborhood, breakfast at the same time each day, evening meals followed by quiet time together in the living room. Buddy thrived on this predictability, and Marcus could see the dog's confidence growing day by day. The breakthrough came 2 weeks after Buddy arrived home. Marcus was sitting on his couch after work, tired from a long day, when he felt something warm press against his leg. He looked down to see Buddy resting his head against Marcus's knee, looking up at him with completely trusting eyes. When Marcus reached down to pet him, Buddy didn't flinch or pull away. Instead, he leaned into the touch, his eyes closing with what Marcus recognized as pure contentment. That evening, for the first time, Buddy's tail began to wag with real joy instead of just cautious acknowledgement. It started slowly, then built into a full, enthusiastic wagging that seemed to involve his entire body. Marcus laughed out loud at the sight, and Buddy's tail wagged even harder in response to his happiness. From that day forward, Buddy began to show more personality. He developed preferences. He liked sleeping in the morning sunlight that came through the living room window. He enjoyed watching Marcus cook dinner from his favorite spot by the kitchen doorway. And he had a particular way of greeting Marcus when he came home from work that involved a series of small, excited jumps. But the most amazing transformation was in Buddy's eyes. The fear and hollow exhaustion that had defined his expression in the alley were completely gone. Now his eyes sparkled with intelligence, curiosity, and something that Marcus could only describe as happiness. This was a dog who was finally beginning to understand that he was safe, loved, and home. As spring arrived and Buddy's health and confidence continued to improve, Marcus began to notice something extraordinary developing in his dog's behavior. It started with small gestures that seemed almost human in their thoughtfulness and intention. When Marcus would come home particularly tired from work, Buddy would bring him his favorite tennis ball, not to play, but simply as an offering, dropping it gently at Marcus's feet before settling beside him. These weren't the typical behaviors of a dog seeking attention or treats. There was something deeper happening, something that seemed to come from a place of genuine understanding and gratitude. Buddy had developed an almost supernatural ability to read Marcus's moods and respond with exactly what was needed. On difficult days, he would rest his head on Marcus's lap and stay perfectly still. On happy days, he would bring energy and playfulness that lifted Marcus's spirits even higher. Marcus began to understand that Buddy was trying to communicate something important, something that went beyond ordinary dog behavior. The way Buddy would sometimes sit perfectly still and stare at Marcus with intense concentration, his head slightly tilted, suggested a depth of thought and emotion that took Marcus's breath away. It was as if Buddy was trying to find a way to express feelings that were too big for simple tail wagging or face licking. One evening in late April, as Marcus sat on his couch reading, Buddy suddenly stood up from his usual spot and walked to the center of the living room. Marcus looked up from his book, expecting Buddy to ask to go outside or perhaps bring him a toy. Instead, what happened next would become one of the most beautiful and unforgettable moments of Marcus's life. Buddy began to move in a way Marcus had never seen before. It started with small rhythmic steps in place, his front paws lifting slightly off the ground in perfect timing. His tail was wagging, but not in the usual side-to-side motion. Instead, it moved in controlled circles, almost like he was conducting music only he could hear. Marcus set down his book and watched in amazement as Buddy's movements became more elaborate. The dog began to turn in slow circles, his steps light and precise, his head held high with what could only be described as joy and pride. His entire body seemed to be moving in harmony, every muscle coordinated in this spontaneous expression of pure happiness. But this wasn't random playfulness or excess energy. There was intention in every movement, a purposefulness that made it clear Buddy was trying to communicate something specific. His eyes never left Marcus's face during the entire performance, as if making sure his message was being received and understood. The dance lasted for nearly 3 minutes, during which time Marcus felt tears streaming down his face. He understood with absolute certainty that he was witnessing Buddy's way of saying thank you, not just for the food, the shelter, or the medical care, but for something much more profound. Buddy was thanking Marcus for seeing him as worthy of love when the rest of the world had given up on him. As the dance concluded, Buddy came to rest directly in front of Marcus, sitting with perfect posture, his chest puffed out with pride and his eyes shining with unmistakable love. The moment felt sacred, like a ceremony of gratitude that transcended the usual boundaries between human and animal communication. Marcus knelt down on the floor and opened his arms, and Buddy immediately moved into his embrace, pressing his head against Marcus's chest where he could hear the heartbeat of the man who had saved his life. They stayed like that for a long time, both understanding that something profound had just been shared between them. From that evening forward, Buddy's gratitude dance became a regular occurrence, though never predictable or routine. It would happen at moments when joy and thankfulness seemed to overflow from somewhere deep within his heart. Sometimes it was triggered by something as simple as a particularly good meal, or a successful walk where other dogs and people had been friendly. Other times it seemed to come from nowhere, as if Buddy's happiness simply demanded physical expression. Marcus began to document these dances with his phone camera, not to share with others but to preserve the memory of these incredible moments. Each dance was unique, but all carried the same message of profound gratitude and joy. Watching them later, Marcus was always struck by the intelligence and emotion in Buddy's eyes, the clear intention behind every movement. Word of Buddy's remarkable gratitude dances began to spread through Marcus's circle of friends and coworkers, though he was careful about who he told the story to. Some people were skeptical, unable to believe that a dog could express such complex emotions through choreographed movement. Others were deeply moved by the account, recognizing something profound in the bond between Marcus and Buddy. Dr. Martinez, the veterinarian who had treated Buddy during his illness, was fascinated when Marcus described the dances during a routine checkup. She had seen many rescued animals over the years, but few had recovered so completely from trauma or developed such unique ways of expressing their emotions. She asked Marcus to bring video footage to their next visit, curious from a professional standpoint about this unusual behavior. When Dr. Martinez viewed the videos, her reaction was immediate and emotional. As a veterinarian, she had studied animal behavior extensively, but she had never seen anything quite like Buddy's intentional, rhythmic expressions of gratitude. The dances clearly weren't random or instinctual. They were thoughtful communications from a dog who had found a way to bridge the gap between human and animal understanding. Marcus's neighbor, Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who lived in the apartment next door, had initially been nervous about Marcus bringing a pit bull into their quiet building. Her fear came from years of negative media coverage about the breed, and she had worried about her safety. However, over time, she began to witness Buddy's gentle nature and the incredible bond he shared with Marcus. The breakthrough in their relationship came when Mrs. Chen fell on the stairs outside their building, spraining her ankle and unable to get up. Buddy, who was with Marcus returning from their evening walk, immediately sensed her distress. While Marcus called for help, Buddy approached Mrs. Chen carefully and lay down beside her, offering his warmth and presence until paramedics arrived. From that day forward, Mrs. Chen became one of Buddy's biggest advocates in the building. During one of Buddy's gratitude dances in the apartment, Mrs. Chen happened to be visiting, having stopped by to bring Marcus some homemade soup. She watched, in stunned silence, as Buddy performed his elaborate routine, tears streaming down her weathered face. Later, she told Marcus it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, a pure expression of love that transcended species barriers. As Buddy's story spread, Marcus began receiving requests from local animal shelters and rescue organizations to share their experience. They were interested in understanding how he had helped such a traumatized dog recover so completely, and they hoped his methods might help other rescued animals. Marcus was initially reluctant to speak publicly, feeling that his relationship with Buddy was deeply personal and not something to be put on display. However, when he visited the shelter where he had first learned about proper dog care and saw the many pit bulls and other dogs waiting for homes, Marcus realized he had an opportunity to help. He began volunteering at the shelter, using his experience with Buddy to help other frightened and traumatized dogs learn to trust again. The most meaningful moment came when Marcus was asked to work with a young pit bull named Luna, who had been found in conditions similar to Buddy's original situation. Luna was terrified of humans, aggressive toward other dogs, and had been at the shelter for months without a single adoption inquiry. Using the patience and gentle consistency he had learned with Buddy, Marcus began working with Luna. The process was slow and challenging, but gradually, Luna began to respond. The first time she approached Marcus willingly, the first time she accepted food from his hand, the first time her tail wagged in his presence. All these moments reminded Marcus of his early days with Buddy and filled him with hope for Luna's future. During one of their sessions, something extraordinary happened. Buddy, who had accompanied Marcus to the shelter, witnessed Luna's first tentative tail wag. As if understanding the significance of the moment, Buddy began one of his gratitude dances right there in the shelter kennel area. Luna watched in fascination, and for the first time since her rescue, something that looked like curiosity replaced the fear in her eyes. That dance seemed to communicate something to Luna that humans couldn't convey, that it was possible to move from fear to joy, from abandonment to love, from despair to celebration. Within weeks, Luna had improved enough to be placed in a loving home with a family who had specifically requested a dog with a challenging past, wanting to provide the kind of second chance that Marcus had given Buddy. 2 years after that first encounter in the alley, Marcus and Buddy had become inseparable partners in life, each having transformed the other in ways neither could have imagined. Buddy had grown from a terrified, malnourished stray into a confident, joyful dog, whose gratitude dances had become legendary among everyone who knew their story. Marcus had discovered depths of patience, compassion, and love within himself that he never knew existed. The most remarkable aspect of Buddy's dances was how they continued to evolve and deepen over time. What had started as simple expressions of gratitude had become complex communications that seemed to reflect Buddy's growing understanding of the world around him. He would dance differently after visits to the dog park, where he had successfully made new friends, differently after helping Marcus through a difficult day at work, and differently still after their volunteer sessions at the animal shelter. Each dance told a story, and Marcus had become fluent in reading the subtle variations in movement, timing, and expression that conveyed different meanings. There were celebration dances, comfort dances, welcome home dances, and what Marcus had come to think of as pure joy dances that seemed to happen simply because Buddy's happiness demanded physical expression. On the second anniversary of finding Buddy in the alley, Marcus decided to return to that spot for the first time since the rescue. He wasn't sure what motivated this pilgrimage, perhaps a need to acknowledge how far they had both traveled, or maybe just curiosity about how the place would feel, now that it held such significance in their lives. As they walked down the familiar alley, Buddy showed no signs of fear or traumatic memory. Instead, he seemed curious and alert, sniffing around the area where he had once cowered in terror. The alley looked different now, cleaner with new lighting and fresh paint on some of the building walls. The neighborhood was slowly improving just as Buddy had improved. When they reached the exact spot behind the dumpster where Marcus had first found Buddy, something magical happened. Without any prompting or encouragement, Buddy moved to the center of the alley and began the most elaborate and beautiful dance Marcus had ever witnessed. This wasn't just gratitude. This was a celebration of transformation, a joyful acknowledgement of the journey from despair to hope, from abandonment to belonging. The dance lasted nearly 10 minutes, with movements that seemed to tell the entire story of their relationship. There were slow, careful steps that reminded Marcus of those first tentative approaches to the food bowl. There were spinning celebrations that echoed the joy of Buddy's first night sleeping peacefully in his new home. There were graceful leaps that spoke of the confidence Buddy had found through love and security. As the dance concluded, Buddy came to rest at Marcus's feet, looking up at his human with eyes that shone with intelligence, love, and unmistakable happiness. In that moment, Marcus understood that they had both been rescued in that alley 2 years ago. Buddy had found safety, love, and a home. Marcus had discovered his capacity for unconditional love and the profound joy that comes from making a difference in another being's life. Their story didn't end with the rescue or even with the first grateful dance. It continued to unfold daily through shared walks, quiet evenings at home, volunteer work at the shelter, and countless small moments of connection and communication. Buddy's dances became a symbol of resilience, gratitude, and the transformative power of compassion. Marcus often reflected on how a simple decision to investigate a sound in an alley had changed the course of 2 lives so dramatically. He thought about all the people who passed by suffering every day without stopping, and he felt grateful that something had made him pause and listen to that faint whimpering on that October evening. The man who had once built homes for other people had discovered that the most important construction project of his life was building a bridge of trust and love with a frightened dog. The scared pit bull who had learned that humans meant pain and abandonment had found one human who meant safety, consistency, and unconditional love. Together, they had created something beautiful from something broken, and Buddy's joyful dances would forever serve as proof that even the most damaged hearts can learn to celebrate again when touched by genuine compassion and unwavering dedication. Their story became an inspiration to everyone who heard it, a reminder that sometimes the most profound rescues happen when we open our hearts to those the world has forgotten or abandoned.